So just a couple of housekeeping items, our code of civility as it's been for past roundtables. First and foremost, welcome. And we are excited to have you here. We're excited to be partnering with our colleagues and students from St. Leo University as part of this ethics roundtable. The goal of today is to create an open and civil environment of mutual respect where all participants can feel welcome. So please note that this roundtable is being recorded, and by remaining on the Zoom session, you are agreeing to and providing your consent to be part of the recording. Just a couple of housekeeping items in terms of how things are going to work this morning. We'll begin with a 15-minute panel presentation. We have three excellent panelists with us here this morning. I invite you to set your screen to speaker view so that you can see each of the speakers as they are presenting their information. I also ask that you mute yourself throughout the session. We will have certainly time for Q&A as we move through this morning's roundtable. You are invited to ask any questions of our panelists using the chat function. There may be some time at the end of the roundtable for open dialogue, in which case you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question. Finally, as part of our commitment to civil discourse, please be mindful that it is okay to disagree, but please be respectful. Argue against the question and not the person. So with that, I'd like to get started by introducing our panelists. Actually, I'll introduce myself first. I know some of you may not know me. I am Dr. Robert Doyle. I'm professor of philosophy and religious studies here at Marymount California University, where I've been teaching ethics since 2018. I'm pleased to welcome to our panel, Dr. Randall Woodard. Dr. Woodard is a professor of theology at St. Leo University, where he has been teaching theology and world religions since 2018. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Fisher. Dr. Fisher is an assistant professor of religious studies here at Marymount California University. He has been teaching world religions since 2019. And I'm waiting, I'm not sure if he's here yet, but we will introduce him. I'm sure he'll show up eventually. Join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Tapie. Dr. Tapie is Associate Professor of Theology and Director of the Center for Catholic and Jewish Studies at St. Leo University. So again, welcome our panelists. So pleased to have you here to be part of our conversation this afternoon. So I have a few opening remarks to set the stage for our conversation, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to present. All right. So in a newly published book called Countering Hate, author Christine Hoover notes that, and I quote, "The recent rise of hate in America is undeniable, but it is not a new phenomenon. In fact, what we are seeing is a resurgence of hate, of exclusionary and harmful beliefs and actions that view certain human beings as unworthy of human dignity and respect. Hate, as we know, takes on many forms. While we don't have time to discuss all the various forms of hate here this morning, we do want to situate our conversation in the context of two seemingly undeniable breeding grounds for hate: politics and religion. To illustrate this point, I'd like to briefly mention the case of a Michigan State Representative, Cynthia Johnson. This case took place shortly after the 2020 election. Johnson, who is Black, she blasted Republicans for inviting former President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to a hearing with supposed witnesses of voter fraud. Soon after, the Democratic lawmaker's phone began ringing nonstop. Over 2 days, Johnson received over 100 calls from Trump supporters. She had been doxxed, and now her harshest critics had a direct line to aim their racist threats at her. One particularly disturbing comment shouted, "You should be swinging from an effing rope, you Democrat." The voicemail was laced with other racial slurs. Johnson's Republican colleagues did not come to her defense. One lawmaker even questioned why she would go public with any of these comments. Johnson, in her response on Facebook, posted, and I quote, "Warning to you Trumpers, be careful, walk lightly." She also says, "And for those of you who are soldiers, you know how to do it. Be right, be in order, make them pay." Republican leaders called Johnson's comments unacceptable and un-American. Republicans also said they are looking into further action. What we're seeing here is a breakdown of dialogue from two parties. One party shouting at the other and the other responding with violent threats as well. This case is certainly not something that is isolated. It's indicative of many other cases throughout the country over the past year. It certainly demonstrates hate, but in addition, it demonstrates, I think, how ill-prepared we are to have difficult conversations on both sides of the political aisle. And so here we are this afternoon, through the lens of ethics and against the backdrop of widening political divide. This roundtable is going to examine the potential for meaningful conversation. In particular, it's going to explore the practical application of ethics to help frame conversations on civility, dialogue, and othering, so that these conversations might yield productive results. I want to briefly just note author Robert Bellah in his work, The Good Society. He frames difficult conversations by three characteristics: attentiveness, responsibility, and trust. Attentiveness for Bellah, and I quote, implies an openness to experience, a willingness to widen the lens of appreciation when that is appropriate. He goes on to note that responsibility implores social participation with an enlightened citizenry. He writes of trust that the heritage of trust has been the basis of our stable democracy, and that this in fact seems to be eroding. So it is against this backdrop of attentiveness, responsibility, and trust that today's roundtable is set. Our driving question is, how can we move from divisive conversations toward meaningful dialogue? As I mentioned, we have an excellent panel to provide their own perspectives on this topic. We'll first hear from Dr. Woodard, then Dr. Tapie, and conclude with comments from Dr. Fisher, and then we'll move on to our dialogue. And so with that, again, I'd like to welcome Dr. Woodard from St. Leo University. So grateful that you are here with us, and we're looking forward to your comments. Dr. Woodard.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for organizing this and for having us all together. You know what I'd like to do is our time is very limited, so I just wanted to share two basic ideas that I don't think are extremely profound. But I've been working in a field where I deal with religion and politics, and then I'm very personally interested in those two ideas as well. And they're stereotypically those two things that you shouldn't talk about because it's going to bring about anger, frustration, conflict. So I just want to share two ideas that I think that I've seen help. And it really is two simple things: how I view myself, and then how I view other people. And when it comes to viewing myself, I want us to think about one word that I've seen help when it comes to difficult questions, difficult conversation, and it's humility. And one thing I've seen is a lot of times we misunderstand what humility is. I think we see things like a false sense of humility. Humility doesn't mean I'm bad. It doesn't mean I'm foolish. What it means is kind of a realistic understanding of where I am and where I stand. Meaning I have values, I have priorities, and these things are good. I should embrace them. But it also means I have my limitations. I have my own bias. I have my own preferences. And one of the biggest problems I've seen in terms of people practicing humility, and I know I've struggled with this myself, is the desire to be right. A lot of times me assuming that I'm right, and I think we are all guilty of this, and it's just a natural human way of living. If I didn't believe the things I believed and I didn't think they were right, I wouldn't believe them. So I think generally most of us, our starting point in almost any conversation is I'm right. And if you agree with me, then you also are right. And if you don't agree with me, then we're going to have, an issue. And what I found, especially in terms of the idea of dialogue, is a lot of times our dialogue, because I'm right, and that's my starting point, we wait for somebody to close their mouth and then boom, we're ready to jump in. And what's happening, a lack of humility means I'm not actually listening. I saw this and really struggled with this early on in my career. I can remember the very first college class I ever taught. I was a doctoral student. I was 23 years old. And I walked into the classroom with this overwhelming fear that somebody would ask me a question that I did not know the answer to. And now that I've grown up a little bit, it happens all the time, but it's amazing. I can remember in my entire education, I've heard one professor in my entire life say the words, "I don't know." And it really stood out to me. It's the only time I've ever heard a professor in class say, "I don't know." And the person followed up with, "But I'll find out for you for next class." And I think a lot of times this trickles down to all of us. Psychologically, we benefit from the feeling that I'm right. Sociologically, we want to group together with the tribe that's on our side. So some of the dangers are we refuse to take feedback. And we've seen this, I bet some people have seen these videos that are somewhat comical. They do this in the political sphere. I'll quote a politician that you like, but I'll actually share words with a politician you don't like, if that makes sense. So I think I'm hearing somebody that I like, and I'll listen to the words and I'll absolutely love them, but then it's revealed that, hey, this is the politician you hate. And people are just kind of dumbfounded and don't know what to do with this. And really the idea is, if I'm humble, I know my limitations, which means I'm actually open to listening to other people rather than waiting for them to make a mistake for me to attack, or waiting for their mouths to close so that I can suddenly go after and explain to you why I'm right. And here really is one thing I'd like us to think about with the idea of humility. Humility is necessary for dialogue. Otherwise, we're really only interested in monologue, which means me as being right, telling you where you're wrong. The second idea I want us to get to think about is built on how I view myself, and the idea of humility and being teachable and wanting to learn from other people is going to impact exactly that. How do I look at others? And I want to give us kind of this analogy or maybe a metaphor to think of. With our lives, we've all been given this giant pile of bricks. And I get to choose every day, do I want to use the bricks to build a bridge, or do I want to use these bricks to build a wall? And if I see other people as a threat, and think of the numerous industries and even our political system that benefit from me looking at other people as a threat, we really, in a lot of ways, are trained to see other people as dangerous. So what am I going to do? I'm going to use those bricks to build a wall, and I'm not actually going to listen to you. I can think of a good friend of mine as a terrible example I also saw in grad school. He was a year ahead of me, so I benefited from using all of his used books. And it was amazing. I saved a ton of money doing it. But when I would read the assigned chapters, I would see not only underlining, but I would see his like angry comments towards the author, where instead of listening to a new perspective, which is really the point of education and dialogue, he was having this angry fight with all of these authors without any sense of humility and any sense of listening. What was he doing? He was rejecting somebody else's priorities, values, and was refusing to enter into any sort of dialogue. Part of the humility realizes that not only do I have my own priorities, values, and bias, but other people do too. So despite that, what do? I look at you as a human person with dignity. I respect that, and I use my bricks to build a bridge, to really listen attentively so that I can understand who you are, where you're coming from, and I'm not waiting to come back with a comeback, a punchline, a zinger, a bumper sticker to prove you wrong. Just for the sake of learning and listening and respecting you, I'm able to close my mouth, respect others, and use those bricks to build a bridge rather than a wall to bind me in with my tribe and my people that all think the exact same way. Rather, the humility allows me to be opened up to others and really actually encounter somebody else in dialogue, which means I probably listen more than I speak.
Thank you, Dr. Woodard. I appreciate your comments this morning, especially in terms of focusing on humility and the idea of building a bridge rather than building a wall. On that note, I'd like to turn our conversation over to Dr. Tapie. Again, we want to welcome you to the conversation, Dr. Tapie, and we look forward to your comments. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Tapie, and I want to build on what Dr. Woodard said briefly by just saying that dialogue, in my experience, requires virtues. And the idea that we can talk to one another assumes that the we that's involved has certain type of disposition. What type of disposition might that be? Dr. Woodard has suggested humility. I want to add a virtue, courage. One of my heroes in interreligious dialogue is a man named Jules Isaac. I want to talk about his life briefly. He was a Jewish historian, and he's a person that motivates me to be involved in dialogue, even though I can't see the end or the goal. So today's title is The Ends of Dialogue, right? But we engage in it not really knowing what the end looks like, because our limited human experience is such that we don't know what the end of dialogue looks like. We don't know where we're going with the conversation. We don't know if it's going to be fruitful. And that can be scary. So how do we push through and engage in talking to people who are different from us, despite the fact that we don't know if it's going to be effective? It's tough. But one of my heroes is Jules Isaac, as I mentioned, and he was instrumental in passing what is now considered one of the most important documents encouraging interreligious dialogue in the world, Nostra Aetate. This is a Latin term for in our time, and the document is actually a document that was passed by the Catholic Church in 1965. Jules Isaac, as I said, was a French Jewish historian now credited with initiating the Second Vatican Council's 1965 declaration, Nostra Aetate, which reframed in positive terms the church's relationship to Judaism, as well as other religions, and finally condemned anti-Semitism. Isaac was born in France on November 18th, 1877. He fought in World War I. He became a professor of history and eventually served as France's Inspector General of Public Education. But after the Nazi occupation of France, he was removed from his post, like many other government officials, in 1940. While on the run with his wife, Laurie, and staying in farmhouses and hotels in order to avoid drawing attention to the Nazis, Jules Isaac began writing what would become a highly influential book called Jesus and Israel that detailed negative teachings about Jewish people in some Christian writings. On October 7th, 1943, while Jules Isaac was on a walk away from a hotel where he had checked in just days before, the Gestapo arrived at this hotel and took his daughter and his son-in-law and his wife. The Gestapo also searched his room, and they told the manager they would come back for Isaac later that day. He was overwhelmed with grief and disoriented, and he asked permission from the hotel manager to return to his hotel room to see if the Gestapo had taken his manuscript that he had been working on. He had stored it in a suitcase. He wrote the following in his memoir. The thought came to my mind that I had to know whether the Gestapo had taken what remained in our room. My suitcase contained not only my clothes, but my precious manuscripts, the first two parts of my book, Jesus and Israel. I rushed over to my suitcase. They had touched nothing. The manuscript and files were still there. I removed them and I put them in my briefcase. End quote. Isaac left the hotel with just the clothes on his back and the manuscript. He journeyed to another town where a professor helped hide him outside on the outskirts of the French town. Isaac referred to this day as the furious storm by which my life was to be forever demolished. On October 28, 1943, at 10:03 a.m., his family would be sent off to Auschwitz. Only the son-in-law would survive. Many scholars are aware today that this man, Jules Isaac, played a decisive role in the push for the Second Vatican Council's statement, which condemned anti-Semitism and called people to interreligious dialogue. On June 13, 1960, 22 years after the Gestapo had killed his wife and daughter, Isaac succeeded in obtaining an audience with the Pope, John XXIII. And in his meeting, he presented him with a document that demonstrated the presence of unjust statements about Jewish people in some Christian teachings. Indeed, the document that Isaac presented to the Pope actually included material from the manuscript that the Gestapo passed over when they searched his hotel room decades ago. At the close of the meeting, Isaac asked the Pope to form a committee to study the document, and he asked whether there's a glimmer of hope he can take away from the meeting. And Pope John replied to him, "You are entitled to more than hope." Isaac's appeal was very successful, and the Pope could not stop talking about his interaction with Jules Isaac after the meeting. In 1965, Nostra Aetate, the document that condemned anti-Semitism, would be passed at the Second Vatican Council, in part because Jules Isaac asked John for the statement. Isaac, though, would not live to see Nostra Aetate promulgated or announced. He didn't see the document announced. He died in 1963. So as we reflect on what it means to be in dialogue together and the sort of persons that's required for dialogue, it seems Jules Isaac is a good example. He motivates me all the time to have courage to continue having difficult conversations, even though we can't see the results.
Thank you, Dr. Tapie. I appreciate how you started your comments with, what is the end of dialogue? And Isaac's example clearly illustrates he was not able to see the end of what he started. And so sometimes just asking the question and working towards that is more important than recognizing what the end of that dialogue is going to yield. And finally, I'd like to turn our attention this morning to Dr. Fisher and invite you to provide your comments on our conversation about dialogue today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today, and thank you to Dr. Woodard and Dr. Tapie for their comments, particularly on humility and the significance of recognizing each other's inherent dignity and worth that we all have. And that really is the starting point. If we don't respect each other's humanness from the outset, it's hard to have dialogue. But it's also hard to extend that respect when others don't seem to want to extend it to us, or people come from groups of historical disadvantage who perhaps either locally or globally have felt left out of the conversation, or that the conversation has been defined for them before the conversation has even started. So if humility is where we should what we should be striving for as a guide, I want to recognize that sometimes it's hard for us to get there, and I think that was recognized when particularly on the side of the desk in a classroom. Well, as you said, we want to be right, and so sometimes it's hard for the professor to say, oh, you know what, I don't know. And then thank you for the analysis of Nostra Aetate, because we talk about that in class, and I think this is an excellent angle, and I wasn't familiar with that story. So thank you for sharing that. I want to step out into a little bit more of the macro level through my interest in religion and systems. Religion and politics, as you know, if you've taken any of the courses that I've taught, really go hand in glove. And for us to have an ability to distinguish between religion and politics assumes that we live in a framework in which, to quote Robert Bella, is indicative of what we call a civil religion, in which people come from different backgrounds, different religious identities, and they're living in the context of a more common space where this kind of civil religion emerges as a third point. When we talk about this in class, we use the analogy of the national anthem and the football game. We talk about the various objects of civil religion, symbols like the flag, the scriptures like the Constitution, etc. So I think a question that we can ask is, if there's a resurgence of hate that has been occurring, why is this happening? And more importantly, perhaps, why is our civil religion that has been operative in this country since its inception, arguably, why is it insufficient to address this resurgence of hate and kind of bring us all back to that e pluribus unum, out of many one, right? And I want to propose that we have kind of a wider cause for this. There's no simple answer for like the causes of conflict, but there does seem to be a wider trend happening right now. And it certainly seems like we have more access to communication with each other than ever before. And more importantly, more people have a voice than ever before. There are people who have been historically left out of the conversation that, thanks to our technologies, whether it's social media or SoundCloud or whatever, we're able to have a voice, share our interests, share our concerns. But we're also able to limit the voices we hear. In the past, when you had 3 news channels, ABC, NBC, CBS, you had to hear kind of a coarse grain narrative about all things. Now, perhaps it was controlled by the dominant group, sure. But what that means is that there's kind of a common narrative that people are hearing when they are consuming the media. Fast forward to cable news, satellite radio, et cetera, now we have algorithm-based social media that feeds our interests back to us. And so we have a confirmation bias in the information that we consume. And going back to the theme of humility, we have to be more aware of that. I'm not a big person that's like, oh, Luddite, technology, bad, things are changing, let's avoid it. No, it's inevitable, it's going to happen. The old generation gets older and they stop understanding what's happening to a degree, and the younger generation's like, yeah, we got this, no problem. So it's inevitable, that's going to happen. But I want us to be aware of how these kind of communications are, I don't want to say dictating how we think, but conditioning to a degree how we think. And we need to have the humility to recognize that this dynamic is happening so that we purposely seek out voices that are different from ours, that we might disagree with, for the purpose of informing ourselves about what the other perspective has. We should not have fear about hearing something that challenges what we think, but rather use that as an opportunity to hone what we truly believe on the topic and to enter into dialogue. So it's both kind of self-reflection and self-assessment, as well as perhaps an opportunity to dialogue and change a person's mind. But you're not going to change a person's mind if you attack them, of course. It's, you know, that classic saying, it's easier to attract flies with honey than it is vinegar. So that's something we need to be aware of. I think civil religion is a helpful concept. People could say that we have a decline in civil religion, or we've lost a sense of civil religion. But I think we could interrogate that and say, well, whose civil religion has it been? Who has had the opportunity to set the tone of what counts as being an American, what American identity is all about? And while I don't think the frustrations of the response of the person who was being attacked, who you mentioned, perhaps is not the most conducive or effective way to respond to situations, you know, I think those of us who maybe have benefited through the history of dominant narratives need to be a little bit more humble when we hear people who are coming from positions of vulnerability. And you know what? I don't know what it's like to be an immigrant in America. I don't know what it's like to be Black in America. And so when I hear somebody talking about their experience coming from something that's outside my own, when it talks about, you know, my experience, whether it's, you know, white culture, issues with maleness in culture and patriarchy, etc. Those of us who are the objects of that critique, we want to get defensive and defend. Well, wait a second, not everyone, not everything. But instead of that defensive reaction, I'm going to invite us to try to exercise that humility that Dr. Woodard talked about and say, you know, what do you mean? Tell me more. We're not only do we not want to say, I don't know, but we also don't want to be vulnerable and say, well, what do you mean? Tell me more about that. I would like to learn more about your perspective, because I kind of care more about us being human together than either of us being right. And so I think the last thing I'll say about this thing with communication, we have more access to voices, but we tend to have an enclave mentality. But I would say that proximity to difference helps cultivate empathy. The more we're familiar with differences other than what we are already familiar with, the more empathic we can become for the circumstances, right? So, you know, maybe somebody should change their mind about their perspective on race relations, etc. What's going on in their background? What's preventing them? What are the factors? We tend to approach things as if it's a libertarian, not political, but philosophy-wise, of like, I have, you know, freedom of choice, and I'm weighing proposal A versus proposal B. But as you mentioned about the quotes from different political parties, that you then show the person who they're coming from, and we're like, wait a second, I don't believe in it anymore because it's coming from that person. You know, that's that ad hominem where we're appealing to the person and the tribal allegiance rather than the ideas. And so, you know, there's some housekeeping I think that needs to be done with ourselves in terms of national dialogue, but just an awareness of how our communication is kind of creating eddies and associations of mindsets that we retreat to and we find our solace there. And then I don't have to worry about what everybody else thinks, because I know that my people on X group on Facebook or Snapchat or whatever thinks the same way. And so we have this inflated sense of being right. And when we know we're right, it's really hard to listen to other people. So it's okay to be vulnerable, but of course, stand by what you believe to be the case, always.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. I appreciate your comments on civil religion. So I just have a couple questions for our panelists, and while I'm asking the panelists some questions, I would invite you to utilize the chat function and ask your own questions of them. So I want to start with a general question for all three of you. I was drawn to Isaac's story, and I want to start there. He said of his book, Jesus in Israel, that it was born of persecution. And I'm thinking back to the example I started the roundtable with. Representative Johnson, her story was also born of persecution, being called these terrible names. So I'm wondering if difficult dialogue often starts with this idea of persecution, how does that become, or how is that framed in the context of the various ideas that each of you mentioned? So Dr. Woodard, you mentioned humility. So how can we be humble in the face of persecution? Dr. Tapie, you mentioned virtue. How can we utilize virtue in the face of persecution? And Dr. Fisher, you mentioned empathy. So I'm just thinking, starting difficult conversations where one is being persecuted and then saying, wait a minute, be humble, be virtuous, be empathetic. How does that work? And I'll leave that open and see who wants to start.
I mean, thank you, Robert. One of the things that comes to mind for me and my context is in the context of doing interreligious dialogue, is that the persons who are involved in the dialogue oftentimes need to feel that they have the space to articulate their story. And so there's a sense in which our dialogue settings, like the places where we have dialogues, must be tables, if you will, metaphorical tables that are set so that people have the time to tell their stories. Yulzi Sock's story was necessary for the Pope to hear because it's not always the case that the power brokers in society hear the stories of those who have no power. So dialogue can be liberating and can move institutions toward justice insofar as the dialogues give a microphone to those who have no power and let them tell their story.
Thank you. Dr. Woodard?
I think the only thing I might get us to refocus on is the idea of humility. I mentioned the idea that sometimes we misunderstand it with that false sense of humility of like, I don't know anything, I'm worthless. But I think humility puts me in a perspective where I know my limitations, but I'm also willing to stand up for what's right. I don't throw out my values. I don't throw out my priorities. I don't throw out things like, a sense of the common good. So humility would mean I listen attentively and actually open myself up to, voices that are new and different. I really try to understand and respect, but I still have the ability to say that idea is dangerous and these actions are dangerous and I'm willing to stand up. But I do it with that same sense of, limitation, respect, compassion. And we have so many, amazing examples throughout not only American history, but world history of people who were very humble, yet they still stood up and they had a voice. But usually it was informed by authentic listening and real respect, even for the people that may have been causing harm. And of course, it's easy to say that, from the outside of these struggles. But I would just add that humility doesn't just beat myself down and say I have nothing to offer. It's willing to stand up and actually respect what I do have, the priorities I have, the values I have, in addition to listening and being kind.
Thank you. Dr. Fisher?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to be honest and say that I don't feel qualified to speak on how to be empathic in the face of persecution, because I'm just going to go ahead and say that though I face trials like any other human, I don't think I faced persecution to the same degree that some have. That being said, historically, the way in which empathy is created in the hearts of the oppressor within the history of the Catholic Church, and then in other traditions as well, but particularly in our tradition, has been, we see in the early church when you had persecutions and, like people were being killed for their faith, slowly over time, and I know it's a tough sell to the person who was dying for their faith early on, but over the years, the nonviolent and compassionate character of Christians helped change the hearts and minds of middle status Romans that then led to wider political shifts throughout society. So very much a bottom up rather than a top down approach. So to that regard, how do we today create empathy in the face of oppression and encourage others who are perhaps on the oppression side to be listening? I'm going to say art and music are perhaps the fundamental ways in which we bring awareness to the experience of others, because it is through art, music, and I'm using art broadly. It can be performative art too. It doesn't have to be just visual art or anything like that. But through the way in which these types of contexts facilitate narrative, it is through hearing those narratives of others and hearing the experience of others that we can gain empathy. And like I said about proximity, I know a lot of people like to enclave and distance themselves from other people who, challenge them or feel different than them. But I think it's that willingness, particularly if you don't feel in a place of vulnerability, but in a place of allyship, allowing yourself to have those conversations, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, and to promote the common good of all through promoting the life and dignity of individuals. But I think it's really in our art, our music, in which we really kind of bring forth that meaning and identity in which we can relate to each other.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. So I want to turn it over to the audience and our participants here today. And I see a question here from Duncan, who writes about his small town in rural North California, and the Dollar General imposing a mask mandate. And the local community on Facebook is blown up, including the store manager and many members of the community. Many are not polite, and many anti-mask comments are full of errors of fact. So the question to the panelists is, how would you address this conflict? And specifically, do you think religion, the perspective of loving thy neighbor, can be used to find some place of dialogue?
I'm happy to go with that one, at least to start off. I think I would argue that the reaction to the mask mandate is in fact its own religia. There is a binding of folks around these concepts of rejection of civil authority, and any form of imposition of civil authority that doesn't conform with their perception of it assaults that sense of identity. And so resisting the mask mandate is a way of arguably ritualistically participating in this form of religion. Now, what you were asking about, Professor Earle, about the perspective of loving thy neighbor, there is an assumption that belief motivates action. But what we end up finding a lot of times is that beliefs are records and kind of static views in time of actions that have been taking place. And so I think, and this isn't really an answer, but what we're coming to find is that the contents of faith, especially if someone claims that they're X religion and they're doing Y action that goes against that belief, we're seeing that the contents of faith are not sufficient motivating factors for certain behavioral outcomes that we expect and wish to see. Because we should be loving our neighbor and thinking, wow, if I accidentally breathe virus on you that I'm not aware of that I'm holding, then of course that's detrimental to you. So I will do my part and wear a mask. That it certainly informs my personal approach to wearing a mask. But I would argue that those who are approaching this, who are angry about it, even if they identify as Christian, for example, are approaching this from a different religious framework, which means that we have to think about religion in a little bit more of an expanded sense than just belief makes action outcome.
Thanks, Dr. Fisher. Dr. Woodard, anything you want to add to that in terms of the perspective of loving thy neighbor and mask mandates?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I just saw this over the weekend. I was up in North Carolina, having a breakfast at a restaurant, and they my county here doesn't have anything, but it was interesting to watch. And I would offer two ideas. I think there's a decent body of research that is going to say that people are not going to change their minds. It's just that simple, because you can share any kind of factual information on a variety of different contexts. And if somebody has already made up their mind, there's very little that is ever going to change them. So I think the mask fighting is probably going to be with us for quite some time. And then I would throw out a book recommendation. I was mentioning this to Dr. Doyle right before, but Michelle Gelfand has just put out a book that's called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. She's a social psychologist, and she tries to argue that we've been raised in certain ways, and she actually has a chapter on like red and blue states, and questions like this come up in the chapter. And it doesn't excuse action, because we are all responsible for the actions we take. But her research does a fantastic job getting to what's underneath why some people will resist masks until they die, and why some people will be likely to say like, yeah, that's no problem. And part of it is just the cultures we grew up in. So I grew up in a different country, and they're on the list of ones where if the government told people in that country to do something, they would line up as fast as they could and they would obey. And you know, depending on what part of the United States you're from, and depending on what kind of question is being dealt to you, we do have these automatic built-in responses in terms of what we will resist and what we'll resist, even if there's evidence to show us that we shouldn't be, and what we will, you know, be willing to do. So it's kind of interesting. I hate to be a pessimist, but I bet having a conversation about that stuff is generally pointless, because it's people that are throwing bumper stickers at each other on social media, you know, and as Dr. Fisher mentioned, you know, having closed themselves in that place of just listening to the same voices over and over. And a lot of it does just, it's a lot of the cultures we were raised in and how we were raised, depending on all sorts of things to view these types of questions. And it's more in the gut than it is in the brain.
Thanks. Dr. Tapie, anything you wanted to add to that question or answer?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is a local community on Facebook can blow up about lots of things, right? We can probably imagine lots of Facebook explosions that we have seen before, or other social media. So social media may not be the best place for working things out. And sometimes people will say things to each other via text message that they would never say to their face in person. We probably have all experienced a rough text message or two. So electronic media, I don't know, you know, I mean, it raises the question of what communication is best for working out disagreements and conflicts. Sometimes a face-to-face meeting is best. We're doing a program soon here at St. Leo where we're going to be talking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote in response to religious leaders criticizing his direct action movement. Religious leaders were criticizing him, particularly white religious leaders in Birmingham were criticizing him for his nonviolent protests. And so this raises the issue there that Dr. Fisher was talking about various religio-political sort of visions. There's different religious communities with different visions of what the good is for society. But then the question also gives us a principle here of loving thy neighbor as thyself. I think that's very significant. And we shouldn't underestimate the Bible as a common ground for bringing people together on a moral discourse. And so perhaps, you know, there's a way to form some dialogue group there in Northern California. Maybe there already are dialogue groups that are connected to the churches there. Some Catholic dioceses will have officers that are in charge of interreligious dialogue, and they're in charge of ecumenical dialogues, and they're tasked with trying to get people together to have dialogues. And so perhaps maybe somebody at this diocese there in Northern California, sorry, I keep thinking of North Carolina for some reason. So maybe somebody there could help put together an ecumenical conversation on loving thy neighbor in a pandemic and what that means. And have churches gather around and bring in a guest scholar to talk about how to interpret that verse. But it raises the question of what religious perspectives are out there and on the topic of the pandemic, and that's a real challenge. But I think that interreligious dialogue is one way to think about civil dialogue, because as I think Dr. Fisher is kind of hinting at in some ways, some of the differences between people, citizens in our country, even among those who are non-religious, their political visions are held with religious devotion and religious conviction. So it's almost as if we have a clash of worldviews coming from all sorts of different directions. And so any biblical principle like loving your neighbor as thyself can be, I think, a potential meeting ground, but expect for there to be extremely divergent interpretations.
Thank you, Dr. Tapie. As you started your comments, I was thinking about the role of social media and how that plays into dialogue. You know, the echo chambers that we've created, as Dr. Fisher mentioned. Most of us scroll through Facebook just looking at friends that we share similar ideas with. And so we're not going to Twitter to have difficult conversations. We're going to Twitter to either see ideas that we're already familiar with, or just to say something really nasty to someone else and then kind of move on. So we're not drilling down into these difficult conversations using any of the concepts that we've talked about here this afternoon. Thank you. So I want to open it up. Feel free to unmute yourself and direct a question to any of our panelists. And we'll conclude this afternoon with just some open dialogue.
Do you think, like, when people look at social media, do you think is that what caused people to like respond in a way of like negative?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ethan. So Ethan, again, asking, does social media foster our responses to each other in a very negative way? Dr. Woodard, we'll start with you with that one.
You know, this idea I think came up already, and I've seen this, that, you know, if you were face to face with somebody, you'd never say some of the things that you would put in writing. And then, you know, the same thing would move from writing, you know, somebody you know, to just putting a random comment. I think it's not probably necessarily the problem, but I think it's giving us an avenue that we perhaps didn't have before. You know, and it's inviting us into a conversation, and we can use that information to write rude comments or to try to listen to somebody. But, you know, sadly, based on the algorithms, it's probably more likely me trying to side with my team and convince everybody else that we're right, rather than actually, you know, doing some deep listening. You know, I think I know a lot of people who personally think they're changing the world with their Facebook posts, and perhaps it's causing less transformation of the world for good than we might think.
Thank you. Dr. Tapie or Dr. Fisher, anything you wanted to respond?
I mean, look, I'm no specialist on social media or digital media. There are folks that are much more well qualified than I to comment on how social media shapes us. And there's theologians and philosophers working on this right now, asking the question of how digital media is shaping us. But for those who may not realize, you should know that, I mean, social media is being used by anti-democratic political movements to challenge and cause trouble for democracies. And there are disinformation campaigns that are quite vigorous and serious, and they're able to use social media because of its anonymity, because you are able to make profiles and kind of hide, and also produce massive amounts of information. So there's a sense in which social media is a real threat in a way to democratic institutions that we would all I think would agree that are important, that protect things like civil rights and whatnot. So it's a very difficult issue. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., for instance, has an entire department that's focused on combating Holocaust denial. And Facebook has promised to help, and they continually have not lived up to that promise of helping to remove Holocaust denial activity on Facebook. So if we can't get the Holocaust, if we can't get information, accurate information on social media about the Holocaust, it seems it seems quite discouraging when you consider other issues.
Thank you. Dr. Fisher, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, to echo what Dr. Woodard said, it's really hard to disparage somebody if you have to look them in the eye, mainly because shame is a powerful factor. And when you can see that you physically hurt somebody, you feel that sense of sense of shame. And, you know, going back to the Genesis narrative, you have the sense of shame is kind of self-apparent because the man and the woman know they have done wrong. And so it's like, oh, we've offended this person. And so I guess as a rule of thumb, perhaps we can say that, you know, if I'm not willing to say this to somebody's face, should I type it out? But I think to Ethan's point, you were asking about, is this kind of a new dynamic? You know, people have been finding ways to speak ill of each other throughout history. And, you know, growing up in the 90s, people used to pass around notebooks from class to class where they'd write thoughts out to each other and then read them in the next class, and then you'd respond. It's like old school social media. And, you know, people would write about each other or about friends and gossip in those, or people would write something on the bathroom walls. The arrival of the printing press caused echo chambers to happen. In Pompeii, we have, you know, volcanically preserved graffiti that is speaking ill of generations and other politicians, etc. So to Ethan's point, I would say the dynamic is nothing new. However, the scale is much faster and larger. And so that's what we need to pay attention to is the scale and the way that scale is exacerbating this dynamic using these new avenues, such as bots.
Thank you. Other questions? We got about 4 minutes left before we have to wrap up this afternoon. Well, I have one question then for the panelists before we finish today. So in the title, I titled it "The End (parentheses S), the end of dialogue, right? So I'm wondering, is there a situation where you think dialogue just doesn't work, where it might just be better to kind of walk away or redirect our attention or energies elsewhere? Or is dialogue always the answer? Is dialogue always the kind of go-to for these difficult situations? I know it's a tough one.
I have one thought, Rob. I think dialogue is a modern phenomenon, and oftentimes it's a placeholder that we use to refer to, you know, encountering another person in some way in conversation. So it can be incredibly abstract, and there are various definitions and theories of dialogue. So in some ways, it can be a dead end. If we look at it as something that's already defined clearly, I think it's important to recognize that it's not completely defined, that scholars debate what a good dialogue is and what it should involve. And so it's important for, you know, students to recognize that we need you to help us continue talking about dialogue. It sounds kind of silly to ask you to please help us talk about talking, but it's kind of, you know, we need to do that as a society to figure out, how do we encounter one another? Pope Francis has used the phrase culture of encounter to refer to the sort of culture that we need, where people encounter one another as human beings, as brothers and sisters. So how do we talk to one another? We need your help to figure that out, but it's not as if dialogue is all, you know, neat and tied up and we already know what it is. We're still learning how to do it well, and what sort of virtues we need to do it well.
I think that's such an excellent point, and so important in light of our conversation today, that this isn't the how to dialogue ethics roundtable. This is we're trying to figure out, right, what dialogue is and how to move about encountering the other. And it is not definitive, and we need everyone's help in order to do that. Dr. Woodard?
I would just respond to that by saying I've never regretted listening to people, ever. And I intentionally put myself in all sorts of situations where I can just listen and I learn and I respect. But I've also learned when I should close my mouth and when my words are pointless. So that's one thing I've learned, is always listen. Sometimes though, I just don't waste words if there's no point.
Thank you. And again, I think that just reiterates the point of being open, being humble, and being part of the process, that this is not something that is definitive and that we have a roadmap and it's all figured out. So on that note, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Woodard, Dr. Tapie, Dr. Fisher. Thank you for leading us in this conversation on dialogue, for joining us here and fostering, I think, an excellent conversation. And to all our participants, thank you for coming. And I want to echo Dr. Tapie's words. Join us in the process of figuring out what this talking looks like. And that's especially to all of our students. So thank you all. There is another roundtable coming up almost a month from today. It's called From Sea to Shining Sea, California Wildfires and Florida Mangroves. We have 3 excellent panelists. Our own Duncan Earl from Marymount will be joining us to talk about California wildfires. And we'll have 2 guests from St. Leo joining us as well to talk about Florida mangroves. So the topic is the environment. Certainly a timely topic for all of us to partake in. So thank you everyone for your participation, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you.